Late on a humid Wednesday morning in June of 1997, just outside St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, another truck backed slowly behind Sarah Whitmore's farm to dump yet another load of sugarcane waste onto the growing pile. Everyone in town simply called the widow's dump. Nobody asked Sarah whether she wanted it there anymore because after 8 years, people had stopped seeing the woman who owned the land and noticed only the place where the mill discarded what it no longer wanted. Sarah watched quietly from her back porch because arguing had never stopped the trucks before, and experience had taught her that some battles only waste the little strength grief leaves behind. She never imagined the day would come when those same farmers who laughed whenever another truck arrived would stand at her gate asking permission to haul the very same material away. To understand how an entire farming community managed to mistake tomorrow's treasure for yesterday's garbage, we have to go back to the spring of 1989, when Sarah Whitmore became a widow at 29 years old and inherited far more than a struggling farm. Looking back, it would be easy to believe this story is about sugarcane waste becoming valuable, but the truth is that it has very little to do with sugarcane at all. It's a story about how easily people decide something, or someone, has no value simply because they can't yet see what time, patience, and quiet perseverance are slowly creating beneath the surface. By the time Sarah Whitmore understood that lesson for herself, she had already spent years carrying burdens most people never noticed, and long before anyone began paying for what lay behind her farm, she had learned that some of life's greatest transformations happen so gradually that only those willing to keep watching ever realize they are taking place. Before we step back into rural Louisiana in the spring of 1989, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. One of my favorite parts of this channel is seeing people from farms, ranches, small towns, and cities all over the world gather around stories like this, so leave your town, state, or country in the comments below. I'm also putting together a free Last Acre story archive featuring 25 forgotten rural stories, the real historical inspirations behind many of our videos, behind-the-scenes research notes, fascinating historical discoveries, and exclusive story ideas you won't find on the channel. I'll be sharing it first through the Community tab, so if you'd like to receive it when it becomes available, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications so you don't miss the announcement. Now, let's go back to the spring of 1989 to a small farming community just outside St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, because that's where this story truly begins. It didn't begin with mountains of sugarcane waste or farmers lining up with trailers and checkbooks. It began with a young widow who had just buried her husband, inherited a struggling farm, and quietly discovered that losing the person she loved was only the first hardship life still had waiting for her. The spring of 1989 arrived earlier than most years across St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, yet for Sarah Whitmore, the warmth returning to the fields brought very little comfort, because only 3 weeks earlier she had stood beneath a gray February sky saying goodbye to her husband Daniel, the man who had spent nearly 15 years believing the small farm they built together would someday become something they could proudly leave behind. Instead, the responsibility for every acre, every unpaid bill, every aging piece of equipment, and every uncertain tomorrow now rested on the shoulders of a 29-year-old widow who had barely found enough strength to finish the funeral before neighbors began quietly asking what she planned to do with the farm. Most people didn't ask out of cruelty because they genuinely struggled to imagine how one woman could manage a property that had challenged two hard-working people even during better years. The sugarcane fields surrounding the farmhouse had produced only modest harvests for several seasons. Machinery repairs always seemed to arrive before good market prices, and the operating loan Daniel renewed each spring remained only partially paid when he passed away. Sarah understood why some neighbors gently suggested selling while the land still carried enough value to begin another life somewhere else. But every time she looked across the fields, she remembered too many evenings spent walking beside Daniel as he spoke about improving the farm one season at a time, believing that patience often accomplished what money could not. Behind the farmhouse stretched several acres of low, uneven ground that neither Sarah nor Daniel had ever managed to put into production because seasonal flooding, poor drainage, and scattered patches of rock made it the least useful part of the property. Daniel often joked that if the farm had one place nature hadn't finished arguing over yet, it was that forgotten corner behind the tree line, although he never stopped believing they would eventually find a purpose for it. Once more, urgent problems had been solved. Sarah found herself thinking about those conversations one afternoon when two pickup trucks from the nearby sugar mill pulled into the yard, carrying the mill manager and several employees who explained that the processing season had produced far more sugarcane residue than expected, and they needed somewhere to place it temporarily until another disposal site could be prepared. The manager spoke politely enough, but the decision already seemed made before Sarah had the opportunity to answer, because he pointed toward the rough ground behind the farm and remarked that nobody was using that part of the property anyway. He assured her the arrangement would last only a short while and promised the mill would remove everything once another location became available, adding that the trucks would stay well away from her crops and wouldn't interfere with the rest of the farm. Sarah hesitated because something about the conversation left her uneasy, yet standing alone in the farmyard with bills waiting inside the house and little confidence that refusing the request would change anything, she quietly stepped aside as the first truck rumbled toward the back of her property. From the porch, she watched the bed slowly rise as the first load of sugarcane waste tumbled onto the forgotten corner Daniel had always believed still held a future, and although the workers climbed back into their trucks without giving the pile another thought, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that temporary arrangements have a habit of lasting much longer than the people who make them ever intend. The temporary arrangement quietly became part of everyday life, and before Sarah fully realized what had happened, the trucks returning from the sugar mill no longer stopped to ask permission because they simply followed the same tire tracks they had created months earlier, backed into the low corner behind the farm, emptied another load of sugarcane residue, and disappeared again before sunset. The first year ended with promises that the piles would soon be removed. The second passed with new explanations about delays at the mill, and by the third season, almost nobody spoke about moving them anymore because the dumping ground behind Sarah's farm had become something the town accepted without giving it much thought. For everyone else, it was simply a convenient solution to an inconvenient problem, yet for Sarah it became another quiet reminder that people often found it easier to overlook a widow than to keep a promise made to one. The nickname appeared gradually, almost as though nobody could remember who first said it, because children riding bicycles along the gravel road began pointing toward the growing mounds and calling the place the widow's dump, while adults repeated the phrase so casually that many eventually forgot there was a real person living only a few hundred yards away. Delivery drivers joked about recognizing Sarah's farm by the smell before they ever reached the mailbox. Visitors occasionally suggested she ought to be thankful the mill had at least found a use for the back of her property. And more than once she overheard people laughing that nobody else in the parish would have accepted 8 years of garbage behind their home. Sarah rarely answered, because experience had already taught her that defending herself would only convince people she cared about opinions they had formed long before listening to anything she might say. As one season followed another, however, Sarah slowly became aware of small changes that seemed completely unrelated to the growing piles of sugarcane residue. During dry summers, the grass surrounding the dumping ground remained green several days longer than the rest of the pasture. Rainwater disappeared into the soil instead of standing on the surface as it once had, and birds seemed to spend entire mornings searching through ground that had previously been little more than hard clay and scattered rock. She also noticed something Daniel would have appreciated, because every time she pushed a shovel into the earth near the oldest piles, the soil felt darker, softer, and alive in a way she had never seen anywhere else on the farm. None of those changes seemed important enough to mention, yet she quietly filed each observation away in her memory, the same way Daniel used to remember small details about weather, drainage, and growing seasons long before they revealed their meaning. One cool October evening, after the last truck had disappeared beyond the cottonwood trees lining the parish road, Sarah walked toward the oldest pile, carrying nothing more than a small garden spade. She knelt beside the edge, where years of weather had slowly transformed the rough sugarcane residue into something that no longer resembled waste at all, gently turned over a shovelful of earth, and paused as dozens of healthy earthworms disappeared back into the rich, dark soil beneath her hands. She had spent enough years working beside Daniel to know that earthworms never gathered where the ground was dying, and although she still couldn't explain what was happening behind her farm, she stood quietly beneath the fading evening light with one unmistakable thought settling into her mind. The land everyone had laughed at no longer felt like the land she had inherited. The thought stayed with Sarah throughout the following winter because every chore eventually carried her past the old dumping ground, and each visit revealed another small change that seemed impossible to ignore once she had begun paying attention. The oldest piles had slowly disappeared beneath layers of rich, dark earth that no longer carried the sharp smell of fresh sugarcane residue. Wild grasses grew thicker there than anywhere else on the property, and after heavy rains the ground absorbed water so naturally that the muddy pools Daniel had fought for years simply failed to appear. None of those changes happened quickly enough for someone driving past to notice them, yet Sarah had lived beside them through every season, watching nature quietly accomplish what no machine or fertilizer had ever managed to do on that forgotten corner of the farm. Instead of telling anyone what she suspected, Sarah decided to trust the land itself, because Daniel had often reminded her that farms reveal the truth to people willing to wait longer than a single growing season. Early that spring, she cleared a small patch beside the oldest pile and planted tomatoes, beans, squash, and peppers, choosing crops she normally struggled to grow successfully in the heavier soil surrounding the farmhouse. She expected a slight improvement at best, but by the middle of summer, the vegetables had grown taller, healthier, and more productive than any garden she and Daniel had ever planted together, forcing her to stake vines that bent beneath their own weight, while neighbors quietly wondered how a woman whose farm appeared to be buried behind piles of waste suddenly seemed to harvest vegetables that looked almost too healthy to belong there. Sarah accepted the compliments politely without offering an explanation because she didn't yet have one herself, although she found it impossible to ignore the difference each time she carried another basket into the farmhouse. She gradually expanded the garden the following season, planted several young fruit trees near the edge of the oldest dumping area, and watched them establish themselves with surprising speed, while similar trees planted elsewhere on the property struggled through the same hot Louisiana summer. Every success raised another question. And every question brought her back to the same place, where the sugar mill trucks had spent years unloading what everyone else called worthless waste. One afternoon, an elderly neighbor named Thomas Landry stopped beside the garden while delivering a replacement part Sarah had ordered for her tractor, and after walking slowly through the rows for several minutes, he bent down, picked up a handful of soil, and quietly rubbed it between his fingers before looking back toward the dark mound behind the trees. Thomas had farmed sugarcane for more than 50 years, and his expression suggested he was trying to understand something that didn't fit the experience of an entire lifetime, because he finally admitted he had never seen vegetables grow like that on ground which should have been little more than stubborn clay. Before leaving, he suggested Sarah invite someone from the parish agricultural extension office to take a look, explaining that whatever was happening behind her farm deserved to be understood before anyone dismissed it as good fortune. Several weeks later, a pickup bearing the seal of the Louisiana Cooperative Extension Service rolled slowly into Sarah's yard, and after introducing himself, the soil specialist asked if she would mind showing him the place everyone in town still referred to as the widow's dump. Sarah led him through the pasture without saying very much, because she had spent 8 years watching people arrive with assumptions and leave without questions. Yet, as the specialist stepped onto the oldest section of the pile, his pace immediately slowed. He knelt without speaking, pushed both hands into the dark earth, lifted a handful toward the afternoon sunlight, and remained perfectly still for several long moments, leaving Sarah with the unmistakable feeling that he had just discovered something far more important than either of them had expected. The soil specialist remained kneeling beside the old dumping ground long enough that Sarah began wondering whether he had forgotten she was standing there, because instead of offering an immediate opinion, he carefully crumbled the dark earth between his fingers, examined its texture, studied the countless earthworms moving beneath the surface, and slowly walked several yards in different directions before repeating the same quiet inspection. After nearly 20 minutes, he finally stood, brushed the soil from his hands, and smiled in a way that suggested he had just confirmed something he hadn't expected to find on a small family farm tucked away outside St. Martin Parish. He explained that what Sarah was looking at wasn't simply old sugarcane waste anymore, because time had already transformed it into something entirely different. 8 years of decomposing cane residue, steady Louisiana rainfall, naturally occurring microorganisms, and countless generations of earthworms had quietly created an exceptionally rich organic soil amendment capable of restoring land that had been farmed too heavily for too many years. He admitted that farmers often spent significant amounts of money purchasing compost that wasn't nearly as mature or biologically active as what had developed behind her farm, adding that nature had accomplished the work patiently and without interruption, while everyone else had continued seeing nothing more than a growing pile of rubbish. Sarah listened carefully, because although his explanation finally gave names to the changes she had been observing for years, it didn't surprise her as much as it might have several seasons earlier. She had already watched vegetables flourish, fruit trees establish themselves with unusual strength, and soil that once cracked beneath the summer sun become soft enough to hold moisture through weeks of dry weather. So the specialist wasn't revealing a miracle hidden behind the farm nearly as much as he was confirming that the land had quietly been telling the truth all along. Before leaving, he encouraged Sarah to protect every inch of the oldest material, because replacing something that had taken 8 years for nature to create would require another 8 years of patience, regardless of how much money anyone was willing to spend. News traveled through rural communities the way it always had, moving from one conversation to another until people who had never met began discussing the same story as though they had witnessed it themselves. Within days, farmers who had laughed whenever another sugar mill truck disappeared behind Sarah's property started hearing that an agricultural soil specialist considered the widow's dumping ground one of the richest sources of organic material he had examined anywhere in the parish. Most dismissed the story at first because it sounded too strange to believe, yet curiosity has a way of growing quickly whenever crops become harder to produce and soil becomes more expensive to restore. The first visitor arrived only a week later, not carrying another load of sugarcane waste, but driving an empty trailer instead. He walked slowly around the old piles, occasionally pushing his boot into the dark earth before quietly asking Sarah whether the rumors were true and whether she might consider selling a few truckloads if she ever decided she had more than she needed herself. Sarah looked toward the same corner of the farm where trucks had once arrived carrying something nobody wanted, and although she had imagined many different ways those 8 difficult years might eventually come to an end, she never imagined the first person to stand there asking permission would arrive, hoping to take the very thing everyone had spent so long throwing away. The farmer returned the following Saturday with 2 neighbors, and by the end of the month, Sarah had welcomed more visitors to the back of her farm than she could remember receiving during the previous 8 years combined, because word had quietly spread throughout St. Martin Parish that the widow everyone pitied might be standing on something far more valuable than anyone had imagined. Most people arrived with the same mixture of curiosity and disbelief, walking slowly across the dark ground, kneeling to feel the soil for themselves, and asking the same questions the agricultural specialist had already answered. They wanted to know whether the stories were exaggerated, whether vegetables had truly grown that well, and whether the rich black material beneath their boots had really begun life as the sugarcane residue they had watched trucks dump year after year without giving it a second thought. Sarah answered every question patiently because she understood that very few of the people standing before her had ever intended to hurt her personally, even though their jokes and careless words had often done exactly that. She explained what she had observed over the years without pretending she had known the outcome from the beginning, admitting that she simply noticed small changes one season after another until they became impossible to ignore. Whenever someone praised her for seeing what nobody else had seen, Sarah gently reminded them that the land had been revealing the truth all along, because nature rarely hides its work from people willing to watch carefully enough. As more farmers began carrying small loads of the mature organic material back to their own fields, stories soon returned from every direction across the parish. Vegetable growers reported healthier plants and improved harvests. Sugarcane producers noticed their soil holding moisture longer during dry weeks, and families whose gardens had struggled for years found themselves harvesting crops they had never before managed to grow successfully. The piles behind Sarah's farm slowly became smaller for the first time in nearly a decade. Not because the sugar mill had finally removed its waste, but because farmers now treated the material as something worth protecting instead of something worth discarding. The greatest irony arrived only a few weeks later when the manager of the same sugar mill drove into Sarah's yard and quietly asked whether she would be willing to meet with him. Time had softened much of the confidence he carried years earlier, and after walking together toward the old dumping ground, he admitted that the mill had spent years paying to dispose of material that local farmers were now eager to buy. He explained that hauling the residue away had always been considered an unavoidable expense, yet after hearing the agricultural specialist's findings and seeing the growing demand throughout the parish, the company had begun reconsidering the way it handled what it once dismissed as little more than waste. Sarah listened without interrupting because she had learned long ago that people often see yesterday's decisions differently once tomorrow arrives. The manager eventually asked whether she would consider working with the mill to develop a proper composting operation so future sugarcane residue could be managed intentionally instead of carelessly discarded, explaining that the company would gladly purchase the knowledge she had gained through years of patient observation. Sarah smiled quietly before answering that she would help on one condition, and when he asked what she wanted in return, she simply replied that the soil should never again be treated like a place where unwanted things were hidden. It should be treated as the beginning of something worth growing, because the greatest mistake they had made wasn't dumping the sugarcane waste. It was believing that anything nature keeps working on can ever truly be called worthless. Several years later, visitors driving past Sarah Whitmore's farm would have struggled to imagine that the healthiest ground in St. Martin Parish had once been the place everyone avoided because the old dumping area no longer resembled the scarred corner of land where truck after truck had unloaded unwanted sugarcane residue. Fruit trees now stretched their branches across rich living soil. Vegetable gardens supplied more produce than Sarah could use herself. And every spring, local farmers arrived not to laugh at the widow's farm, but to learn how healthy soil could be built with patience instead of purchased with haste. The greatest transformation, however, hadn't taken place beneath the ground at all, because it had happened inside a community that slowly learned the difference between throwing something away and failing to recognize its value. Sarah never became the wealthiest farmer in the parish, nor did she seek the kind of attention that often followed unusual stories like hers, because she believed the land deserved far more credit than she did. Whenever someone thanked her for helping restore a worn-out field, she gently explained that all she had really done was pay attention long enough to notice what nature had been doing all along. The earth had carried out the difficult work one quiet season after another, and she often smiled while saying that patience is sometimes the finest tool a farmer will ever own, because there are things no amount of money can persuade the soil to do before it is ready. One autumn afternoon, as Sarah walked beneath the shade of the oldest pecan tree on the farm, she found herself standing at the edge of the very place where the first truck had emptied its load all those years before. She closed her eyes for a moment and remembered Daniel laughing as he once looked across that forgotten piece of ground, insisting that every farm contains one corner still waiting for someone to understand it. At the time, she thought he was simply refusing to give up on difficult land, but standing there now, she realized he had been talking about much more than soil, because people, like farms, often carry hidden possibilities that only reveal themselves to those patient enough to keep believing through the hardest seasons. Perhaps that's why this story has never really been about sugarcane waste. It's about how quickly we decide that something has no future simply because we cannot yet see what time is quietly creating beneath the surface. The people of St. Martin Parish weren't wrong because they lacked intelligence. They were wrong because they judged the land before nature had finished its work, and they judged a grieving widow before life had finished writing her story. In the end, the greatest treasure behind Sarah's farm wasn't the rich compost that farmers eventually came to buy. It was the reminder that value often arrives long before recognition does, and those willing to look beyond today's appearance are often the first to discover tomorrow's harvest. I'm curious what you think. If you had owned that farm, would you have fought every truck that arrived, or would you have done what Sarah did and quietly watched the land before deciding what the future might hold? I'd genuinely enjoy reading your thoughts, so let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from, because your stories are part of what makes this community so special. If you enjoy thoughtful rural stories like this, we'd love to have you join us by subscribing, because here on The Last Acre, we share a brand new story every day about the people, places, and quiet lessons that continue shaping life across the countryside. Thank you for spending part of your day with us here on The Last Acre, where every acre has a story, every field remembers, and the quiet lessons of yesterday still have the power to shape tomorrow. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you tomorrow with another story.